Hello and welcome. This is the Zen community of Oregon, making the teachings of the Buddha Dharma accessible to support your practice. New episodes air every week.
So I want to start talking about the precepts. In a sense, 1/3 of our practice. Maybe even more as far as lived experience. It's almost all of it. And the precepts are sometimes called the Buddhist Guidelines for Ethical Living, which is not a very sexy title. And that's okay as a description. And the first thing that I'm aware of when I want to teach the precepts is I really don't want to present this in a moralistic way. And that's hard because the religions of our culture are moralistic. There is good and bad, and the divine said which one is which. And the Buddha didn't teach something like that. Right? The idea of the precepts is multifaceted. But one dimension of that is you poke the universe and see what sound it makes. Now, all of us have been poking the universe for, at least 20 years. Some of us 40, 50, 60, 70 years. And it's been making sounds. And some of those sounds, we're not sure why it makes those sounds. Okay? We don't actually know why some aspects of our life don't seem to work well. Right? It's hard to make connections between our behavior, the stance of our mind, the condition of our heart, and what happens to us. In what ways are those related? So the precepts, rather than being a set of rules, so you can join the club and wear one of these fine bibs, are really a way to study the feedback of the universe in our own lives, which is our own heart and mind, and our own behavior. Excuse me. So I want to start talking about the precepts. And maybe a class format is better because it's more interactive. But I'm going to do some talks on them. And if I start sounding moralistic, you can raise your hand and say, Jogen, you're getting kind of heavy-handed here. Or if you start getting moralistic about the precepts, you can remember me with this preamble. And you say, well, Jogen said this isn't about moralism. Zen practice is very concerned with how to be a loving being. Not because being a loving being is good, but because why not? Showing up as a loving being tends to have the best result in every situation. It tends to have the most positive energy. It tends to create the most harmony. It tends to add life to a situation. How to be the most loving being, or how to show up as love in any given situation. Not as some heavy-handed, sentimental thing, but in a way how to not add difficulty or friction to the situations we already find ourselves in. So that's one way to understand these precepts. Now, today I want to talk a little bit about the 3 pure precepts. What is the feeling that I'm not doing what I should be doing? What is that feeling? Some of you might know that feeling. I'm not doing what I should be doing. Okay? It could be something similar, which is something is off with my life. Something is off, actually, with my life. It's not quite right. Now, sometimes that is what we might call a character issue or a psychological issue. That one has some kind of fixed belief, some attitude that was inherited, or some issue around self-esteem, belonging, etc. Now, the Dharma can actually really help with those, but so sometimes this sense that I'm not doing what I should be doing, or that something off with my life, is a character issue. Call it that, or a psychological issue. But then sometimes it's true. Sometimes we have that feeling, and because we are the universe, and because you poke the universe, it makes a sound. That's the sound of, yes, something is off. It's helpful to be able to listen and distinguish between those two. Sometimes they're very kind of mixed up. So sometimes that feeling that something is, I'm not doing what I should be doing with my life, is actually our honesty. Right? One of the last teachers I worked closely with talked a lot about how it's very difficult for human beings to actually be honest with themselves. It's really hard. Sometimes that feeling that something is off with my life is our bodhicitta calling. And we could say it's divinity calling. I have this belief, or maybe a sensibility, that sometimes the future reaches back to me and says, hey, I'm going to go a couple more degrees this way. And I'm like, I don't know why. But the future's like, no, really, just go a couple more degrees this way. As if our potential kind of communicate with us. And sometimes it will communicate by making us feel bad or feel off. Nothing gets our attention more than when we feel bad. You know how you wake up in the morning and you feel even a little bit off, and like everything organizes around getting rid of that feeling a little bit off. What's wrong? What can I take? Who can I blame? Right. Another version of this is sometimes we feel we need to be helping more. We need to be doing more about the suffering in the world. Right? And sometimes that is a consequence of our exaggerated sense of individual power. And if I was out there, I could do something about the way things are. Or if enough of us were out there, we could do something. Sometimes that's an exaggerated sense of individuality, and sometimes it's actually true. And something is calling to us and telling us, you could be doing something. Now, working on the precepts, they're a practice, by the way. They're not like something you kind of just click, or check, box you check off. They're a practice. Is doing something about the world, right? Because you're a piece of the world. You're a vast piece of the world that encompasses and interpenetrates other pieces of the world. So when you do something about you, you are doing something about the world. I'm kind of getting into bumper sticker territory, aren't I? It's too bad, because I think it's true. Another way to say this is that sometimes healing, aligning, finding peace of heart comes from attending to our behavior in a more subtle way, in finer and finer ways. Right? The problem is external, in a sense. It's with how I am showing up. Because you poke the universe and it makes a particular sound. So there are, in Buddhism, there are lots of different maps of the precepts in different traditions. There are precepts that emphasize more be a being who lives a life of utter non-harm, and in a way sequester yourself from the sources of a harm so that you're just not a node in the network of suffering at all. And so you live a life that's blameless. And that's one of the terms I like from the Buddha. Talked about living a blameless life, right? And in the Buddha's view, at least at that time, spoke about the monastic life, that version of the monastic life, lived in one way or another by Theravada monastics, as a life that is really removing yourself as a node in the chain of suffering. There are precepts that emphasize more compassion or action. They're more injunctions rather than saying, don't do things. Here's what you shouldn't do. They say, lean into this. There's precepts in the Tibetan tradition that are like this. The Zen precepts, the 16 precepts that are practiced in this community that came from Japan. They basically originated, the current form that we practice them originated in, I don't know, maybe the 10th century. They're kind of right down the middle. They include suggestions to take certain actions, and they also have suggestions of what not to do. Right? Don't do this, do that. It has that aspect. And you could look those up. They're the 16 Bodhisattva precepts. I wanted to start with the 3 pure precepts. These might be the oldest of the precepts as far as the teachings. I think if you read the Dhammapada, who has read the Dhammapada? Oh, well, that's really good. Not very many people. I recommend you read the Dhammapada. This is actually, I think, the most translated Buddhist text. And I'm not a historian or a scholar, but I know it goes way back. And it gives you a real sense of the essential flavor of the foundations of Buddhism. In that, in one aspect of that, the Buddha says something like, cease from evil, purify the mind. This is the teaching of all the Buddhas. And then we have the 16 Bodhisattva precepts, which are part of this tradition, as I mentioned, and then you find the 3 pure precepts. And in a way, they're like the biggest sweep of how to think about behaving as a Buddhist, how to think about the spiritual life. For some people, it's such a big sweep, it's not helpful. It says, do good. Well, what is good? It says, cease from evil, and you think, well, what is evil? Right? It says, purify the mind, and you say, when do I get there? But when we take these as prompts for personal investigation, they start to work on us. When we take them as practices, they're actually useful. So that's how I'm going to talk about them. Now, I want to, before I do that, I don't really know how to organize talks, so I'm always like doing this sort of thing. Now, before I get into that, I'll get into that, and then, sorry, college dropout. When we listen to teachings on the precepts, when we think about the practice of the precepts, it may be helpful to consider that there are three aspects to practicing with these. Practice, what does that mean? That means living them and failing at living them and struggling at living them and loving at living them and coming back to living them, and that's what practice is. First of all, there's the literal aspect. So this, one of the precepts says, of the pure precepts is do good, right? And so the literal thing is do good. Do good things. Do actions that anybody would say that's a good thing to do. That is unharmful. That is positively contributing. That's the literal. In that, we're emphasizing the actual impact of the action with the literal above the intent. With this facet, the literal of don't kill means do not kill beings. If one really emphasized or spent time practicing the literal do not kill, they might look at their diet. They might, sell their weapons. They might say, oh, actually, I can't work for this bank anymore because we actually are funded by military weapon manufacturers. You might think in that way when you say, literally, I'm going to commit to not killing. Right? One would have to remove oneself from that network. But the literal is only one aspect of precepts from a Zen point of view, or at least my Zen point of view. The next is the spirit of the precept. In this, it's saying that the intent is just as important as the impact. Right? It's not about never tell a lie so much as I'm going to investigate what it's like to not use speech that manipulates and deceives. Because in a way, one can agree to be a good person and do all the right things and never get down to the deeper aspect if you don't explore the spirit of a precept. And if all you do is follow literal behavior and never get into the spirit of an ethical thing, you're actually likely to break it at some time when your willpower falters, if you've never really investigated the essence. So literal, the spirit, which is saying that the intent or the essence is more important than the action and its impact. And then maybe most importantly, at least it has been in my practice, we have humility. And this is interesting. This aspect of the precepts is saying you never keep it perfectly. You never do. That when one is living a vibe of self-honesty, we always feel a little bit soft-hearted because we know we're an imperfect human being. Somehow we're able to see where the daily failures of love, the capacity to see those and not to let the critic get a hold of them is there for us. We're aware of the daily failures of love, and that keeps us grounded and from the problem of purity. Actual purity might be a good thing. Someone being aware that they're actually pure is probably not a good thing. But the humility level also has another aspect to it, because it's saying there's no perfection for a human being. I just think these days, everybody, no matter how you live, you're connected to networks of suffering. How could you be pure in this world? So no perfection, but the humility is the universe cannot be stained by me. You cannot stain the universe. It's unstainable. A human being does not have a capacity to blemish the perfection of existence. Not even fill in the blank with the first person who comes to your mind. Not even those guys. I can't stain the universe. Sometimes our critics are really intense and they think, I'm so bad, I've stained the universe. No, you haven't. You're just poking the universe a certain way, it makes a noise, and that doesn't feel good. But you can't stain the universe. This is sometimes called Buddha nature. So when we practice with precepts and we think about them, these three facets in tandem is a kind of alchemy. It prevents the extreme of indulgence that we say, well, all that matters is the spirit of the precepts. It doesn't matter if I lie. It doesn't matter if I am just a random dick to somebody. It doesn't matter. It's all one. It prevents that extreme. And on the other side, it prevents the extreme of rigid purity. It's hard to live a bodhisattva if you're on either side of those. Indulgence, people can't quite trust you. Rigid purity, you're not very fun to hang out with. Can't be a bodhisattva. Okay, let me look at the time. I probably should already stop. Maybe I should stop for tonight. Because I can't do this quickly.
Thank you for listening to the Zen Community of Oregon podcast, and thank you for your practice. New episodes air every week. Please consider making a donation at zendust.org. Your support supports us.